There's a photograph. It's sitting on a side table in a warm, candlelit living room on Christmas Eve. Mismatched ornaments, the kind of room that looks like it was put together by love rather than any sort of plan. In the corner of that photograph, almost like an afterthought, almost like it had always belonged there, is a small framed picture of a girl in a blue dress at her college graduation. That girl's name is Claire. And she had absolutely no idea that photograph existed. No idea that her father had carried it into a life he never once mentioned to her. No idea that it had sat in the room where he spent his happiest evenings for over a decade while she drove him to doctor's appointments and cooked his Sunday dinners and quietly wondered why he always looked a little far away. She found out because he died, and because he left a will, and because in that will was a name that made an entire room go completely silent. This is a story about a secret, but more than that, it's a story about what fear costs us, and about what we leave behind when we run out of time to explain ourselves. Edward Guthrie was not a complicated man on the surface. Born in 1941 in a small Pennsylvania mill town. Father on the line. Mother taking in laundry. No inheritance of his own. No shortcuts. Just a boy who had decided somewhere along the way that he was going to build something, quietly, patiently, the way water carves stone, without ever announcing itself. By 35, he had a regional supply company running. By 45, it had spread across 3 states. By 60, the Guthrie name carried genuine weight, old-fashioned integrity, the kind of reputation you actually have to earn. He married Margaret, a schoolteacher from Ohio who loved her garden and had no patience for unnecessary fuss. They had 2 kids. Thomas, the eldest, and Claire. They lived in a colonial house on 12 acres. Holiday dinners that went on for hours. A family that looked, from every possible angle, exactly like a postcard. But here's the thing about postcards. They only show you one side. Margaret passed away in 2009. Long illness. The kind of ending that takes something out of everyone in the room and never quite gives it back. Edward kept working after she was gone. Kept showing up. Smiled at the right moments, signed the right checks, but people who knew him well. And there weren't many who genuinely did. Noticed that something had gone quieter in him. Something essential. Thomas, his son, had spent 30 years assuming the business would come to him. Edward had never said anything to confirm that. But he had never said anything to contradict it either. That silence, it turns out, was its own kind of message, just not the one Thomas had been reading. And Claire. Claire had given up a graduate scholarship to stay close when her mother got sick. After Margaret died, she simply folded herself into the role of caretaker without hesitation, without complaint. Sunday dinners. Doctor's appointments. Long, quiet evenings in a house that felt too big for one person. She never asked for anything in return. That was just who Claire was. When Edward died in October 2021, at 80 years old, he left behind a will that had been carefully prepared, deliberately sealed, with strict instructions from his attorney. It was to be opened only with the full family present. Nobody knew what was inside it. They should have expected that they didn't know. The attorney's office was above a hardware store on Main Street. Not the kind of setting you would choose for a scene that changes everything. But these things never happen where you expect them to. Gerald Pierce. Soft-spoken, careful. Placed the sealed envelope at the center of a small table. Thomas sat with his arms crossed already, in his mind, cataloging assets. Claire had brought a thermos of coffee she'd made that morning, because bringing something warm was simply how she showed up to things. Gerald told them before opening anything that Edward had revised his will 18 months before his death. Quietly. Without telling either of them. He also told them there was a handwritten letter. Addressed to the whole family. To be read aloud first. Claire wrapped both hands around her thermos. Gerald unfolded the letter. Edward's voice came through those pages the way it always did. Direct. Unspectacular. Warm in a way you had to listen for. He thanked his children. He said he was proud of them both in different ways. For deeply different reasons. He said every choice he had ever made, he had made with intention. And then, one line. There is someone I should have spoken about openly, and I did not. That was my failure. Not theirs. The room went still. Gerald looked up, almost instinctively checking that they were both still with him. They were. Neither of them moved. Edward had written that for 11 years. From 2010 until just before his death. He had been in a relationship with a woman named Ruth Alderman. He had met her 2 years after Margaret passed. He had not introduced her to his children because he did not know how to. He had told himself the right moment would come. It never did. And eventually, he wrote, too much time had passed, and the silence between his 2 worlds had become its own wall. Ruth was not mysterious. She was a retired librarian, 67 years old, with 2 adult children of her own from a previous marriage. She had been, by Edward's own account, his closest companion. The person who made the last decade of his life feel less like a quiet ending and more like something still worth living. Thomas's expression shifted. The kind of shift that happens when something clicks into place that you did not want to click. Claire went quiet in the way she always went quiet. Filing it away. Making sense of it before she would allow herself to react. Gerald set the letter down and opened the will. The house. The investments. The business holdings. A fair and detailed distribution that addressed Thomas directly. And then, near the bottom of the final page, a substantial portion of Edward's personal estate, including the original family land deed and a private savings account that no one had ever known existed, had been left entirely to Ruth Alderman. Thomas stared at the ceiling for almost a full minute. He didn't say a word. Claire looked at the document. Then at her brother. Then at the gray November light pressing through the window. There were lawyers after that. Group texts. Long sleepless nights. Thomas contested a portion of the inheritance. Not out of hatred for Ruth, but because grief, when it doesn't know what to do with itself, reaches for the most familiar tools. For Thomas, that meant control, documentation, formal process. It was resolved without going to full trial, a modified distribution, enough for Thomas to feel heard. Enough for Ruth to feel that Edward's intentions had been honored. But that legal outcome is almost beside the point. Because weeks later, when the noise had started to settle, Claire said something that quietly became the center of this entire story. She said, "I think Dad was more afraid of disappointing us than he was afraid of anything else in the world." And that fear cost him 11 years of honesty. Sit with that for a second. Edward Guthrie had spent over a decade sharing his life with a woman who made him profoundly happy. He had laughed with her, traveled with her, sat beside her through ordinary evenings that meant everything. And his children, who loved him and whom he loved with his whole heart, had been kept outside that door the entire time. Not out of cruelty, not out of selfishness, out of a very human, very understandable, and ultimately very costly fear that his happiness might somehow look like a betrayal of the life they had all shared before. He was a devoted father who also happened to be a man quietly drowning in his own guilt about his right to be loved again. Claire agreed to meet Ruth about 6 weeks after the reading. Thomas wasn't ready. He said so plainly without inventing an excuse. Which in its own way said something. The meeting was at a small cafe in the town where Ruth lived. Claire arrived not entirely certain what she was looking for. Maybe answers. Maybe some way to reconcile this woman sitting across from her with the 11-year secret her father had kept. What she found was a quietly dignified woman with kind eyes and a photograph of Edward on her phone. It was from a hiking trip in Vermont in 2017. In the photo, Edward's head was thrown back, laughing at something just off camera, eyes completely unguarded, completely at ease. Claire hadn't seen her father look like that in years. Ruth talked about him the way you talk about someone you actually knew. His stubbornness, his dry humor. The way he always overtipped at diners without thinking twice. The book stacked on his nightstand that he never quite finished but could never bring himself to put away. She said he talked about Thomas and Claire constantly. She said he kept a photograph of the four of them. Edward, Margaret, Thomas, Claire. On a desk in a study she had never once been invited into. Claire asked her directly, "Did you know he never told us about you?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. She said she had asked him to change that more than once, and he had always found another reason to wait. She said he loved you too much to risk being seen differently by you. I think in the end, he forgot that love can hold more than one truth at a time.